So we're just talking about how it is that a bank creates money and what limits the ability of a bank to create money, given that by just granting a loan, it's going to make deposits go up, and if deposits go up, we've got money, so why don't banks just keep on granting loans, right? Now, we've already said previously that there are three tools which the Reserve Bank can use to limit the amount of money that a bank can create. One of those tools is the required reserve ratio. In other words, any deposits that the bank gets, the bank needs to keep a certain amount of cash, a certain percentage of those deposits need to be held as cash. That's the required reserve ratio. So when banks make loans and their deposits go up, the amount of cash that they need to hold as a reserve, right, is also going to be going up. If the Reserve Bank doesn't make more cash available, then you can understand that at some point, the amount of deposits that the banks are going to want to lend is going to, the amount of loans that a bank's going to want to make, the amount of deposits that are ultimately going to end up on the bank's balance sheet are going to be bigger than the amount of cash that the Reserve Bank has made available, right? If we get to that situation, the bank's got a problem because legally it's not allowed to be in that position. So therefore it has to cut back on its loans to decrease its deposits. So it can only loan and create deposits as long as it has the reserves to match those deposits. Okay? So let's see what happens. Initially, the Reserve Bank prints 100,000 rands. Okay? Prints 100,000 rands through open market operations, buys government bonds. That 100,000 rands enters into the economy and ultimately gets deposited in banks' bank accounts. Okay? Are you happy with that? It gets deposited with banks. So banks have an extra 100,000 rand cash on their balance sheets. 100,000 rand deposit, 100,000 rand cash assets. What's the problem with holding cash for a bank? Doesn't make the bank any money. It needs to lend that money to people. It needs to convert that cash into a loan. So what does the bank do? It loans that full 100,000, okay? If it loans 100,000, what do we know? When it loans that 100,000, people get paid. In other words, when the bank loans the money, the people that borrow the money spend that money, right? Which means someone's getting paid. When they get that cash, what do they do with that cash? Some of the cash they want to keep. They want to put it in their wallets. The rest of that cash, what do they want to do? You can say they save it. They put it in the bank, right? They deposit it in the bank. You with me? So what we're saying here is, if the bank loans out 100,000, some of that 100,000 gets held as actual currency, as cash. People don't deposit it. Some of that 100,000 gets redeposited. Okay? Here you can see that 1/3 of that loan has been held in cash. We would say that the currency drain ratio is 33%. 1/3. Okay? 1/3 of all those loans gets held as cash. 2/3 gets redeposited. So this is a currency drain ratio of 1/3. Let's try it. Currency drain ratio. Okay? It's 1/3. So you can see the description here says the 100,000 rand loan creates 100,000 rand worth of money. Okay? So that loan, that initial loan was 100,000 worth of money because it comes into the system, both as currency and as deposits. But with a currency drain ratio equal to, 50% of deposits, so the currency drain ratio, currency drain is comparing this number to this number here. So it's 1/3 of the total means 50% of the deposit value. So, all right, let's cross that out. Okay, with a currency drain ratio equal to 50% of deposits, deposits increase by 66,667, and currency increases by 33,333. But now the banks have had a deposit of 66,667. Of that 66,667, it must keep a reserve of 6,000. In other words, our reserve ratio here is going to be 10%. Okay, required reserves, so reserve ratio, I'm going to call it RR. Let's do it here. Reserve ratio, okay, so let's just call it RR, is obviously 10%. Okay, 10%. So cash was deposited with the bank must keep on reserve 10%. So of that 66,000, it can then lend another 60,000. With 66,667 increase in deposits, desired reserves increased by 6,667, and 60,000 is loaned. Now they refer to it as desired reserves, okay? And I've just called it the reserve ratio. Sometimes we might call it desired reserves, sometimes we might call it required reserves, okay? Either whether it's desired or required is not that important, except for the amount that they need to keep, that banks need to keep. Usually we assume that banks just want to keep the required reserve amount and no more. Okay? So normally the desired reserve ratio would simply be the required reserve ratio as well. So they need to keep 6,667 as reserves. They can lend out another 60,000. When they lend out that next 60,000, what happens? 20% gets held as currency, and 20,000 gets held as currency, and 40,000 gets deposited once again. That 40,000 deposited, what's going to happen? Well, a certain amount of that 40,000 deposited, just like this original 66,000 deposited, some of that 66 was held as reserve, some of it was lent out. Same thing with this deposit, what's going to happen? Some is going to get held as required reserves, and some of that deposit is going to become a new loan. Okay. So what ultimately ends up happening is 2/3 of any loan amount gets deposited, okay, and then after we've taken out the required reserves, gets loaned out once again. Okay, and of that 60,000 loan, 2/3 gets deposited. Some of it must be kept as required reserve, and then the rest gets loaned out once again. And if you follow this process, obviously each time the amount that's going to get lent out is less and less and less and less and less, right? So from this initial 100,000 increase in the money base, you can see that there's going to be a natural limit to the amount that the banks can actually lend. Because every time that they lend, the amount that gets redeposited is going to be less. And once an amount gets deposited again, a certain amount of that redeposited amount must be kept as a reserve. So only a smaller portion of that amount deposited can get lent again. And if we continue this process, what we have is a geometric sequence. Okay? What does our geometric sequence look like? Well, here's our initial deposit amount, A. What am I talking about? Okay? L is the amount that we will lend of that initial deposit amount. Okay? Then the next time that we lend, it's that same proportion of the total loan times the amount that was lent before. Okay? So we've got A, then we've got L times A, plus L times AL, plus L times AL squared, etc., right? And so we have our geometric sequence. Now you know that the sum of a geometric sequence we can write as A divided by 1 minus L. Okay? If you are not 100% happy with that maths, you can just go on that, what page did I give you now, just now? Sorry, this book keeps moving. It was like page 568, was that right? So, was it 568? Okay, then on the next page, 569, there's a little footnote there, 5. Okay? And that shows you the maths of how you get a geometric sequence. The sum of a geometric sequence is A divided by 1 minus whatever the multiple is. Okay? So 1 minus L. So in our example here where we had 100,000 and that 100,000 led to a loan of 60,000, okay? So we initially lent out 100,000. The next amount we lent out was 60,000, okay? Which means 60% of the original loan was lent out. So you can see in terms of our geometric process, we have 100,000 was our first loan, which led to new deposits, okay? Of those new deposits, we then lent out 60,000 again, which led, deposits plus cash. Cash plus deposits. Then we lent out another 60,000, which became again cash plus deposits. And then from that, we lent out another 36,000, which again became cash plus deposits. So each time the money supply is increasing, we've got 100,000 plus 60% of 100,000 plus 60% of 60,000 plus 60% of 36,000. What we end up with is a geometric sequence which is 100,000 times 1 plus 0.6 plus 0.36. I have no idea what this line over here is trying to tell us, so let's just cross that out. Okay, so we've got a geometric sequence like we've got here. Okay, what is the value of L? The value of L in this sequence is 0.6, right? So what is the sum of our geometric sequence going to be? It's going to be A. A in this example is 100,000. L is 0.6. So we can write this equation. Okay? You can write our geometric sequence as in terms of this equation, 100,000 times 1 divided by 1 minus L 0.6, which is the same as 100,000 times 1 divided by 0.4. 1 divided by 0.4, 2.5, 100,000 times 2.5, 250,000. What that means is that initial increase in the money supply, 100,000, right, led to a total increase in the money supply of 250,000, right? Now, you can see this geometric sequence limits the amount of money that can be created, okay? And there are two things that prevent the total loan amount being lent out again. And those two things that stop the total loan amount being lent out again are the currency drain ratio and the required reserve ratio. Okay? Both of those prevent the total loan amount being lent out again. You got it? Am I stressing something that's actually pretty simple and you totally get it? Or you kind of not really sure what's going on? Not really sure? Okay. If I just briefly recap, are you happy that if the Reserve Bank increases 100,000 rand, increases money by 100,000 rand, right? By say buying securities from banks, banks have 100,000 rand extra cash lying around. What do they want to do with that cash? They want to lend it. When they lend that 100,000 rand to people, what do those people do with that cash? They spend it. When they spend it, the people that get that cash, what do they do with that cash? Some of it they put in their wallets. Some of it they deposit back at the banks. Okay? So of that 100,000 rand that was loaned out initially, how much comes back as a deposit? 2/3 of that total 100,000 is coming back as a deposit, because some of that money is being held by people. Once that new amount is deposited, can the bank lend that total deposit amount out? No, because it needs to keep a certain amount in reserve. That's what the Reserve Bank tells them. That's the law. That's the regulation. You may not lend that total value out. You have to keep a certain amount on reserve, okay, in cash, which means the commercial bank itself has to keep reserves, and in this case we've got reserves of 6,000 of 66,000, so it's 10%, okay? So the reserve ratio is 10%. They have to keep 10%, which means they can lend out the remaining 60. So of the initial 100,000 that was that was loaned out initially and came back and was deposited and then gets loaned out again, only 60,000 gets loaned out again. You with me? So initially we loaned out 100,000. Went out into the economy, some of it came back, and then we can lend again, and the amount that we lend again is only 60, which is much less than the initial 100. And one of the reasons that 60 is so much lower than the 100 is because there's a currency drain ratio. In other words, people just want to hold cash. The other reason is because there's reserves that the commercial bank have to keep. You got it? So what would happen if instead of a reserve ratio of 10%, the central bank said to the commercial banks, 10% is too low, you now need to keep 20%. What does that mean for the amount that this commercial bank would have been able to lend here? Are you happy it would be much less? So if the amount that it was lending was much less, are you happy that this number here, they wouldn't be lending out 60,000. Let's say it was more like 50,000 as an example. You happy with that idea? So the Reserve Bank changes the required reserve ratio, makes it higher. Now the bank can only lend out 50,000 instead of the 60. So in other words, it's only going to be half of that initial 100. And then of that 50, what is this number here going to be? It's not going to be 36. What's the next amount going to be? It's going to be 50% of 50, which is 25, right? In other words, this value here, L, is no longer 0.6, it's now 0.5. And if it's 0.5, what would this multiplier here, it's called the money multiplier, what would the value of this money multiplier be? It would be 1 divided by 1 minus 0.5, which is 1 divided by 0.5, which would be 2. 100,000 times 2, would we still have 250,000? No, we now have 200,000. So can you see that when the Reserve Bank increases the required reserve ratio, increases that ratio, it decreases the amount of money that commercial banks can make. You got that? Now remember what happened here was the Reserve Bank, how did the Reserve Bank get this 100,000 into the economy anyway? We said, take an example, an open market operation goes into the economy and buys government bonds from the Reserve Bank and gives them 100,000 as cash, right? Can you see how by giving 100,000 Rand cash to banks, that increases the money supply in the economy? Not just by the initial 100,000, but by more than that, right? In fact, the total amount will be 250,000, right? So what then do you think would happen if instead of increasing the money base, the Reserve Bank actually decreased the money base? What happens to the total money supply? If they decrease the money base by 100,000, what happens to money supply? It decreases by 250,000. You got it? So if the Reserve Bank wants to change the money supply, it can change the money base by a small amount, changes money supply by a much bigger amount. It can also change the reserve ratio. If it changes the reserve ratio, that changes the money supply, right? What was the third tool that the Reserve Bank had? Do you recall? Remember, what is the repo rate? The repo rate is the cost of a bank borrowing from the Reserve Bank. Okay? When it raises the repo rate, it raises the costs of commercial banks borrowing from reserve banks. Because it raises those costs, what do banks want to do? They want to hold more cash on their reserve bank, on their balance sheet, rather than trying to borrow from the Reserve Bank. Okay? So they're going to want to hold more cash on their balance sheet. If they want to hold more cash, it means they're not going to lend it out. If they don't lend it out, what does that mean to the overall money supply? Exactly. If the Reserve Bank increases the repo rate, banks are going to want to hold more cash. If they're going to want to hold more cash, and then they're not going to want to loan it out, if they don't loan it out, right, then the money supply is not going to be increasing. Okay? And if in fact they hold more cash and they want to hold more cash and the Reserve Bank's not going to give it to them, they might have to call loans in, which means that in fact the money supply decreases because people have to repay their loans. So now we see that the Reserve Bank has these three tools for changing the money supply, and we see how it interacts with banks to change money supply. So having gone through that money supply process, we can now just look at this question one more time. Which of the following policy actions could the Reserve Bank use to combat inflation? So we haven't got to yet how money supply changes inflation, but what I said to you last week was an increase in money supply means an increase in prices. In other words, more money supply, more inflation. We're going to see in a model how that happens. That's all you need to know for now. So basically what this question is asking is, if you want to combat inflation, what should money supply be doing? Should money supply be increasing? No, money supply should be decreasing. Absolutely. So if you want to make money supply decrease, what should the bank be doing? Let's look at these 5 options. Option A, should it be selling government bonds to banks? If it sells government bonds to banks, is it reducing the money supply? When it sells bonds to banks, how do banks buy those bonds? They pay cash to the Reserve Bank. If they're paying cash to the Reserve Bank, are they then keeping, put it this way, if you've got cash on your Reserve Bank and then you spend it to buy a government bond, right, do you still have cash on your balance sheet? No. Okay? So if you don't have cash on your balance sheet, can you loan that cash out? Okay? So if the Reserve Bank sells bonds, okay, let's go back and just look at our diagram one more time. Okay. If the Reserve Bank sells securities in the open market, what happens to the reserves of the bank? They go down. What happens to the securities that the bank owns? They go up. If reserves go down, that means the banks cannot lend that money, right? They don't have cash anymore. They've spent it. They've bought a bond. They can't loan it out, right? In other words, with your cash, you can do one of two things. You can either lend it to someone, or you can use it to buy something, right? That's what you do with your cash. Same thing. You can't lend the money you've already spent. So if you've bought the bond, you cannot lend that money, right? If you cannot lend the money, are you going to increase the money supply? Nope. So, which of the following actions could the Reserve Bank use to combat inflation? Okay, decrease money supply. selling government bonds to reduce the money supply. Does that sound good? Okay. What about option B? And I don't know why it's over there. Anyway, option B. What about buying government bonds to reduce the amount of loanable funds? Well, remember, when you buy government bonds, right, you inject cash. Why? Because if you want to buy government bonds, you've got to pay for them. How do you pay for them? With cash. So you take the bonds, the Reserve Bank takes the bonds, and it gives cash to the banks. What do the banks do with that cash? They can lend it out, right? When they lend it out, that starts the money multiplier process, and money supply increases. So you're happy that option B there is incorrect. Regardless of the second part over here, buying the bonds is not going to reduce the money supply. Okay, option C, raising taxes. Okay, so now we encountered this for the first time. What are the tools of the Reserve Bank? Reserve ratio and repo rate and open market operation. Does the Reserve Bank have anything to do with taxes? Who determines taxes? Government, right? The executive, the treasury. Once a year, Minister of Finance stands up and says, this is how we are going to raise funds. This is how we're going to tax people. Okay? It's part of his budget speech. Sorry, that's not what I want. So taxes is fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is government. Okay? Monetary policy is Reserve Bank. Taxes is not a tool of the Reserve Bank. Taxes is a tool of government. So can the Reserve Bank raise taxes? No. Okay, what about cutting the reserve requirement to reduce the amount of excess reserves held by banks? Okay, well, first of all, if you cut the reserve requirement, will that reduce the amount of excess reserves? No. First thing, if you cut the reserve requirement, it's going to increase the amount of excess reserves. So if you increase the amount of excess reserves, what are banks going to do with their excess reserves? They're going to lend them. So what's going to happen to the money supply? It's going to go up. Okay? So option D is wrong for two reasons. First of all, if you cut reserves, that's going to make money supply increase. And that's not what we want. We want money supply to decrease. So it's wrong on that account. But secondly, the sentence is incorrect because when you cut reserves, it doesn't reduce the amount of excess reserves. It increases them. Okay? What about option E? Cutting the discount rate. The discount rate is another way of saying the repo rate. Okay? Okay. So when you cut the discount rate, that means the same as cutting the repo rate to decrease the availability of loans to banks. Now, when you cut the discount rate or you lower the repo rate, is that going to decrease the availability of loans to banks? No, it doesn't change the availability. If anything, it makes banks want to borrow more from the Reserve Bank, right? Because it's decreasing the cost of borrowing from the Reserve Bank. If you decrease the cost of borrowing from the Reserve Bank, it means banks are happier to hold less money on their balance sheet because if they run out of money, it's cheap, relatively cheap for them to just borrow from the Reserve Bank quickly, right? They don't want to, but if they have to, they will. The higher that cost, the less they're going to want to have to borrow from the Reserve Bank, the more cash reserves they're going to keep. So you're happy that cutting the discount rate is not going to be what we want to do, right? If anything, if we want to decrease the money supply, what should we be doing to the repo rate or the discount rate? Increasing it, exactly. Okay. Anything about this question? Any of those options that you want to get some clarity on? So we looked at this question last week. It was a little bit, maybe a little bit too much. How do you feel about it today? Yeah? Yeah. If you raise the repo rate, it does not reduce the interest rate, no. When you raise the repo rate, it in fact increases the interest rate. Okay? It increases all interest rates. And when we look at the money market just now, maybe not today, but we will see when we actually show a diagram of the money market how that happens, why that's the case. So we haven't dealt with that yet. But when the central bank raises interest rates, it raises all interest rates in the entire economy. Okay, anything else? So there's just three little equations that we can now look at. The first is the money multiplier, MM. Okay? This is called the money multiplier. Okay? So another way we can write the money multiplier is to say the money base times the money multiplier is equal to the total money supply. Okay? Which is just this equation over here. Remember, we took the money base. There was an increase in the money base. Okay, an increase in the money base times the money multiplier equals total increase in money supply. Okay? Are you happy with that? So that's what this equation is telling us. Take the money base, multiply by the money multiplier, and we have the total money supply. Change the money base times the money multiplier gives you change in total money supply. Okay? Total money supply, if you remember, total money supply is made up of deposits and cash. Yeah? Okay? And the money base is made up of reserves plus cash. Okay? So therefore we can write our money multiplier equation as deposits plus cash divided by reserves plus cash. If we divide each one of these terms by D, by deposits, we end up with 1 plus the ratio of cash to deposits divided by the ratio of reserves to deposits plus the ratio of cash to deposits. Okay. So in our example over here, where we had our initial increase in money supply, and there was a currency drain, and there was reserves as well, what did we end up with? Well, we said the cash to deposits, right, which is our currency drain, cash to deposits was 50%. Okay? Cash to deposits, 50%. Reserves to deposits, well, we saw that reserves to deposits was going to be 10%. So reserves to deposits, 10%. So 1 plus 50% divided by 1 plus 50% is 1.5 divided by 0.6, which is our money multiplier, 2.5. Okay? So here, there was two ways there's a number of ways we can calculate the money multiplier. If we know what the money base is, and we know what the, what do we have here? We know what this ratio is here, L, then we can calculate the money multiplier as 1 minus L. So then we can take the money base times 1 minus L, and we'll get the total money supply. If we don't know what L is, but we do know what the currency, the ratio of cash to deposits is, and we know what the ratio of reserves to deposits is, then we can calculate the money multiplier that way as well. So there's two different ways that you can calculate it. You don't get a formula sheet in the tests or exams or anything, so here's something for you to do so that I can stop speaking. what are we told here? We've got this, the banking system in aggregate has a balance sheet that looks like this, and you're told that the reserve ratio is 20%. Okay, so you need to keep 20% on reserve. 20% of what? Deposits. Yeah? Okay. So what is the value of our deposits? So how much do we need to keep on deposit? In other words, what's our required reserve value? Okay, and how did we get 44? It was 20% of 220 equals. So that's what we need to keep on reserve. Everyone happy with that? How much do we have on reserve? 72. And how much do we need? 44. So how much do we have extra? 28. Yeah? So the value of excess reserves in the system is, okay, 72 minus 44 equals, equals 28. There are two options which are 28, right? Okay. So excess reserves 28. If these excess reserves were loaned out, the total value of additional loans created would be what? Okay, so here's what you need to calculate. Here's something called the money multiplier. Oh, and even asks you for that, which is a bit backwards, but anyway. So the money multiplier, what is the money multiplier? It would be the total amount of money, okay, divided by the money base, okay? So if you're a mathsy person, I'm just going to write this slightly differently. If you're not a mathsy person, it's not important. So remember, this equation is MB times MM equals M, right? So if we were to take the derivative of this equation, we're saying the same thing here. MM is equal to change in M over change in MB, right? Okay, so whether we write it the money multiplier is M over MB or change in M over MB, we're going to end up with the same thing, the money multiplier. Now, when we looked at that equation in the previous diagram, we saw that we can write this as D plus C over R plus C. And in this example, we've been given R, we've been given D, because we've been given excess reserves. So excess reserves would become deposits, okay? We haven't been given C, and in fact, what we're going to just assume, because we haven't been given C, is that it's 0, and we normally just assume that it's 0. Currency drain ratio, just assume it's 0, unless you're given a currency drain ratio, okay? So if C is 0, then what we end up with is a money multiplier equation, which is D over, okay, sorry, I say deposits, it's not really, yeah. D, the value here of D should actually really be 1, but I'll have to explain that differently just now, because I can see I have probably made this confusing. Anyway, okay. So, given that we've got this, we can let C equal 0, right? And we've got the money multiplier being M over MB being D over R, okay? The important part here is this, let's write this, I guess, as equal to D times 1 over R, okay? where I'm going with this is, if there is no currency drain ratio, I can actually write this money multiplier as 1 over R. Okay? And then if you want to know what the actual change in money would be, it would be 1 over R times D. But I can see I haven't derived that exactly from this equation, so I've obviously done something wrong there. But I don't know what. So I'd have to come back and figure out exactly how I went wrong there. But anyway, money multiplier, a quick way of calculating the money multiplier, instead of this D plus C over R plus C business, right, is just to say money multiplier when C equals 0 is just 1 over required reserve ratio. Okay? So in this case, the required reserve ratio is 20%. 1 over 20% is 5. Okay? So your money multiplier would have been 5. And then the total value of additional loans is 5 times the amount that would be lent out, so the new deposits. Okay? 28 times 5, which is 140. I'm not sure why I derived that money multiplier incorrectly there, as I say. I did something wrong there, so I'll have to go back and just check when I have the time. But here's what matters. Here, the money multiplier, when there is a 0 currency drain. Okay? 0 currency drain. It's 1 over R. Excuse me? No, so yeah, exactly. So I've messed up something over here. I don't know what I messed up, but I messed something up, right? Well, it should be the following. Where it says money multiply I should not get D over R. I should just get 1 over R is the money multiplier. And then the total amount of money would be whatever our deposit amount was. Oh, you know what it is? Sorry. I know what I've done wrong here. It's because I've assumed, that D was a deposit ratio, right? In other words, I don't have a deposit ratio separate from a currency ratio. My deposit ratio is 1 because there is no currency drain ratio. You get what I'm saying? So my deposit ratio is, in fact, in this equation, D is 1 because there is no currency drain. So when currency drain is 0, D in this equation is 1, which is why the money multiplier is 1 over R. Then 1 over R times the new deposits. I was reading D wrong in that equation here, which is why I messed that calculation up. So the money multiplier, when C equals 0, is 1 over R. Because then D in this equation, by default, takes the value 1. Right? Because remember, D plus C, right? The proportion that is deposits plus the proportion that is cash must be equal to the total amount of that loan, which was the initial amount. So D plus C must equal 1. If C equals 0, D equals the 1. Yeah. So that was how I messed that equation up. My mistake. So when I'm saying D here as this deposit amount, it's not the deposit ratio, which is what they're referring to there. They're referring to deposit ratio. Here I'm referring to a deposit amount. Okay. So we've finished up that example, and then that brings us now to a discussion about the money markets. Okay. We've got the demand for money, we've got the supply of money, and we've got bringing them together. So we've still got a couple of slides to get through. We're not going to do them tomorrow. Remember, tomorrow we're going to take a look at tutorials 1 and 2. And we're going to look at the semester 1, test 1, 2017, which is on Sakai. Please take a look at it. Before we do it, there's no value in you just hearing the answers. Okay? See you tomorrow.